Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, Israel getting set to reopen the skies for international travel. Meanwhile, authorities in Jerusalem preparing for ICC investigations and potential soldier indictments. And finally, a major overhaul in the Israeli civil union system, Haifa extending marriage benefits to LGBT couples. It's now been several weeks since the International Criminal Court's landmark decision to expand its jurisdiction and allow for investigations into alleged Israeli war crimes. And now the court has officially launched a probe. ICC Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda claiming that the investigation will be conducted independently, impartially, and objectively without fear or favor. However, pro-Israel groups are condemning the probe as participating in a disproportionate campaign of delegitimization against Israel and waged by the enemies of the Jewish state. Now, in the meantime, until now, most eyes have actually been on the United States, though, and specifically on Trump-era sanctions imposed on members of the ICC. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, pro-Israel groups globally, and a number of American lawmakers all pressuring President Biden to maintain the sanctions as leverage against potential probes in Afghanistan, the West Bank, and Gaza. Critics, on the other hand, increasing their own pressures on the president to drop the sanctions and allow the ICC to move forwards as it planned. Now, in addition to fears over general investigations from the ICC, Israeli authorities are also now estimating that hundreds of Israeli citizens may soon be subject to arrest while traveling abroad. Israel is not a signatory to the ICC and does not recognize the ICC's jurisdiction. But following the latest ICC ruling to launch an investigation into alleged Israeli war crimes, hundreds, if not thousands, of Israelis may very well soon be at risk. Israel, for its part, then, promising to protect all of its citizens, with Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who is included among those on the chopping block, remaining defiant. Gantz saying that he was never afraid to cross enemy lines before and will continue to stand where he has to today. And this as he condemned the alleged political motivations behind opening probes as well.
I think it's a very negative development, the fact that the ICC has been contaminated by political aspects that creates the situation in which we are the only democracy in the Middle East. We are the only one who follows the international law, and we are the only one to be blamed. That's ridiculous.
What are you doing to counter this?
We have our own teams working in different places to work and to try to influence them, and at the same time we're taking all the measures needed.
How many Israelis, yourself included, might expect to be targeted for arrest?
Yes, several hundreds, but we will take care of everyone.
So what is the risk to Israelis going forwards with the ICC? Well, I sat down earlier today to discuss opposite international relations expert Dr. Emmanuel Navon and director of the Israel-Palestine offices at Human Rights Watch, Omar Shakil. Take a look. Is Israel being overly worried, or is this a legitimate fear that Israelis who are on active duty at times during certain years of service are at serious risk while traveling?
Well, first of all, it's not only Israelis. Let me remind you that one of the reasons why the United States withdrew from the ICC was the concern that, as happened, in fact, the ICC would be used and manipulated for political means in order to investigate and try American soldiers and officers serving in places such as Afghanistan or Iraq. So that concern exists not only regarding Israelis, the manipulation of the ICC by political bodies. When it comes to Israel, first of all, don't forget that there's a new prosecutor at the ICC, and that the Israeli government has a dialogue with the new prosecutor to see if indeed he's going to continue and press with this decision of his predecessor or not.
Look, I mean, I think there's an important contradiction here you're seeing in the argument of supporters of Israel. On one hand, they're saying the court is politicized. On the other hand, they're talking about using politics and pressure as a way to stop the court from independently investigating abuses that take place, on their watch.
Now, if you're interested in hearing the rest of my discussions between Dr. Emmanuel Navon and Omar Shakil, please make sure to check out ILTV's Insider on ILTV.tv or on our YouTube and Facebook channels. Now, good news on the coronavirus front. Israel reporting the lowest overnight contagion since last year. Finally dropping back below 5%, the COVID-19 spread rate now around 4.8%. the lowest 24-hour rate since December. Verified active infections rising, though, by 4,265 since Tuesday to a total of 42,733, 717 in serious condition, and the death toll nearly at 5,800. Still, the vaccinations up overall and the infection rate falling, Israel's COVID cabinet continuing to move forwards with the country's staged reopening. As of Sunday, Israel's Ben Gurion International Airport will open under limited capacity, while the exemptions committee will be dissolved pending approval of the full cabinet. That means that up to 1,000 Israelis will be able to return home per day, rising up to 3,000 per day by March 14. And those flying into Israel will be required only to take one COVID test before boarding and another before entering the country. They'll then be allowed to choose between isolation at home, likely with a bracelet monitor, or in a state-run COVID hotel. As for those choosing to leave the country, only green passport holders will be allowed to fly abroad, and they'll be exempt from isolation upon return. Initial destinations, however, will be likely limited to places like London, Paris, Frankfurt, Kiev, New York, and a couple other U.S. cities. Meanwhile, land crossings with Egypt and Jordan will similarly reopen a couple times a week and for a limited number of people. Nothing without its consequences, though. Public health services authorities warning against the reopening of the skies and the entry of new virus mutations that will likely follow from the move. This as the new and contagious New York strain has already been found in Israel, with at least 3 Israelis confirmed as carriers. Now, as you may remember, Israelis returning from abroad will soon be given a choice for quarantine location between the state-run coronavirus hotels and isolation at home with an electronic bracelet monitor. But the bracelet program is still in its pilot phases, and here to tell us all about it is Ordan Trabelsi, CEO and president of Supercom, which is developing the bracelet system. Ordan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so first of all, let's break this down. How exactly is this bracelet designed to work?
Great, you can see the bracelet here. Essentially, it's a full kit, a bracelet, a smartphone that we provide, and a beacon, a sticker that you put at home.
Okay.
Essentially, it's a Bluetooth bracelet, and it's just supposed to test whether the person is at home during their quarantine. So for 14 days, are they at home? Yes or no? That's the only thing that it's supposed to do.
So, is it basically a GPS link, or is it really just distance from the...
Yeah, so actually, this is not a GPS bracelet, it's a Bluetooth bracelet. We're not tracking the location of the person.
Sure.
The bracelet's on their hand or on their... Here you go.
Yeah.
That. The bracelet's on their hand or on their leg. It's a very lightweight bracelet, ergonomic, waterproof, very comfortable. You never have to charge it when you're using it. And essentially, it just communicates with a smartphone. And so long as there's a connection, then you're in the house because the smartphone is there connected to electricity. If you leave the house, then there's an alert. If you cut the bracelet, there's an alert. Other things you try to do, there's an alert. And that's essentially how the program works.
So, okay, I have to ask, what are the bracelet's limitations then? How do you know if...
It's all powerful.
Yeah, how do you know if the person is just within their home or property complex, but outside of a certain limitation? Do you adjust the range of the device per person?
First of all, most people are in similar sized homes. If someone is in a huge mansion that's very large in size, they could walk around with a phone as well. And then you know that there's a connection between the phone and the bracelet. The phone has GPS and everything on it, but you're not required to have the phone attached to you. In a normal house, you leave the phone in the center of the house, you have the bracelet, and so long as you're doing your quarantine according to what you committed to do, because it's a voluntary program.
Right.
You committed to be at home for 14 days, this just assures that it's happening that way. If you leave your house, or you leave outside your lawn and you go to the mall and you walk around and you start potentially spreading coronavirus, then there's an alert, and that goes to our systems or our partner systems, which is Electra Security in Israel.
Sure.
And they alert the Ministry of Health.
So I have to ask, how is this different really from, say, an ankle monitor that's used for people under house arrest?
So Supercom's been around for 33 years soon, but we've been using this technology of tracking for elements for 15 years. It's any type of element. You can put this on medical equipment. You could put the bracelets on people that are in hospitals for tracking patients, and you can use it also for criminal justice, as you suggested. In the criminal justice field, it's a different technology that we essentially use because it's much more enforcing. Over there, you usually have a GPS requirement to track the person everywhere, not just in their home, whether they're going out or if they're going to work, wherever they are.
Maybe a scaled back model almost.
This is a simple model. It doesn't take any of your personal information, doesn't take your biometrics, doesn't take your actual location. It just assesses that if you're home or if you're not home to give the indication. We're not trying to provide any personal data. We're just trying to answer the simple question is whether the person at home during quarantine or not in the 14 days. So it's not the same solution. This is a customized solution. We call it Pure Care, and it's customized for COVID. And we actually only launched it and started offering it to the world in March of last year when COVID.
All right. Well, so I know the pilot is now underway. That something, correct me if I'm wrong, but about 100 of these units were given out to passengers who chose to participate in the pilot.
Right.
How much does it cost?
So the pilot's completely free. We offered it to the government.
And for participants after the pilot?
So that depends on, there is a cost to this equipment, of course. It
Right.
costs money to manufacture it and to create it. Right now in the pilot, we offered it for free, the first 100 units. It's been applied to people in the airport in the last 2 nights. There were certain flights where people had the choice to choose between the Corona Hotel or the bracelet.
Home.
As you probably assume, most people chose the bracelet and to go home and have their mother's cooking and see their family and so forth.
Who wouldn't?
Yeah, but actually there were a few cases, usually around religious regions, that they weren't still completely
what about for
understanding.
Shabbat? I mean, if this thing runs on the weekend, is there a conflict with that?
So we understand the requirements for the Shabbat electronic products, and we meet those requirements. But since it's brand new, some of the people, more religious, are still not completely sure that they understand how it works and if they have their rabbi's approval. So some of those people decided to, not take the program. Also, you have to put a 1,500 shekel deposit with a credit card. If someone doesn't have a credit card,
but it's
they
a
can't sign
deposit.
into the program.
It's
deposit,
funded at the end of the
just
program.
to make sure you return the equipment.
Sure.
Because at the end of 14 days, someone could throw this into the sea and just go on with
Which would be
it. Yes.
The sea at this point is polluted enough. All right. Well.
And to continue on what you were saying, this is just a pilot. Seems like people like it. Seems like they feel comfortable with it. And right now, the Ministry of Health is trying to get this into larger scale. Sure. We already have thousands of units available at Supercom, and we've increased production to create thousands more every week. We're waiting for the proper request and process from the government, and then we could launch a more large-scale project.
All right. Well, I don't know when my next trip abroad is happening, but I'll definitely be in contact with you guys and getting this bracelet when I come back. Well, Don, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, moving on, Israel-owned cargo ship the MV Helios Ray is now back at sea after suffering a suspected Iranian attack. Last week, the vessel was hit by mysterious explosions where 2 holes were punched in the ship's port side and 2 more on its starboard side. And Israeli and international officials nearly universally putting the blame on Iran, while Iran is denying the charge. That said, tensions between Iran, Israel, and the West have been escalating in recent weeks as Iran continually accelerates its nuclear program. And Israel's ambassador to the United States and the UN, Gilad Erdan, now filing an official complaint with the UN Security Council on Tuesday. Erdan's letter, addressed to U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, blaming Iran for the cargo ship attack, while stressing that repeated Iranian terrorist attacks at sea jeopardize the safety of all international shipping. Well, perhaps easing some concerns, Thomas-Greenfield appearing to agree with Erdan's concerns, tweeting gratitude for a great conversation with Erdan. And this while the United States and Israel reportedly promise not to make any moves pertaining to Iran or the JCPOA nuclear deal without informing the other first. Now, in related news, Israel continuing to cozy up to its new regional allies, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And this sparking reports of a developing special security arrangement over the growing concerns with Iran. Hannah Rifkin with the details.
Defense Minister Benny Gantz saying on Tuesday Israel intends to strengthen security ties with its Gulf Arab allies. Reports by Public Radio Khan claiming that Israel is considering a special defense agreement with the UAE and Bahrain. And Gantz going on to stress the need for security ties between Israel and its Arab allies, but falling short of going into details about what the arrangement will entail, all while downplaying the panic portrayed in the reports.
I don't think it's going to be a defense pact, but we're going to develop defense relations with every country that we have relation with. We have this process of setting up a special security arrangement, and within this arrangement we can continue and develop our relations.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu meeting with the first UAE ambassador to Israel, Mohammed Al-Khaja. The two reportedly discussing joint regional and bilateral projects across a wide range of fields.
Ambassador, welcome.
Great honor and pleasure, sir.
It's my pleasure. I'm delighted to see you. We're changing the Middle East.
Yes.
And now with more on the newly developing regional security arrangements, I'm joined by Reserves Major Dan Fefferman, fellow with the Jewish People Policy Institute and former IDF foreign policy and national security advisor. Dan, thank you so much for being with us. Now, with Iran's continued nuclear acceleration and alleged attack on an Israeli vessel last week, do you believe that special security arrangements between the UAE and Bahrain will be an effective force in deterring Iran?
Right. So whatever kind of arrangements, and I don't think they're going to be anything official, we're not going to be seeing any kind of defense pact with the UAE or Bahrain. And let's keep in mind, of course, Saudi Arabia has not even normalized relations with Israel, and it's the most significant country in that region. But what Iran is trying to do is they're trying to raise the pressure. They're showing their provocations. They're trying to raise the pressure on the United States and, of course, the United States allies, trying to get them to come back into the JCPOA and to lift the sanctions prior to that. So they are looking for any kind of soft underbelly or what we call low-hanging fruit, places where they can attack with deniability. The more that Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia can show that they are prepared from an intelligence perspective, from a preventative defensive measures perspective, and with the United States involved in that, the better it's going to be. On top of that, when the United States just this past week responded militarily against Iranian-backed militias in Syria, that was a clear sign from the United States that it's not going to let Iran get away with these provocations. And I think the more, at the end of the day, Iran is a pragmatic actor. They respond to pressure and they understand very well their limitations. And I don't think they want any kind of military escalation. So the more that we and our new Arab allies in the Gulf, as well as the United States, who has a strong presence in the region, show that we are prepared and that we're also prepared to push back when necessary, I think that it's going to do a lot to deter Iran.
So do you think you could maybe expand a little bit about what these defense ties might entail and what we can infer from that more specifically? Because again, we'd like to know to what extent this pact might go. Are we going to see joint military exercises between Israel and the UAE similar in scale to Juniper Cobra?
It'd be very nice to see those one day, and I think that could be the long-term dream of such a relationship with the UAE, and let's hope we get there. In the meantime, as I mentioned, it's hard to imagine anything of a formal defense pact, anything of open military exercises. Again, because the UAE and Bahrain, for example, have to keep open and positive relations with Iran, who is their very close neighbor and with whom they have significant trade relations, and they still do have diplomatic relations. Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, the most significant country within the GCC, does not have normalized relations with Israel. So as far as that goes, we're not going to see any kind of defense pact, and I think that explains Defense Minister Gantz's kind of taking back what he might have originally said. However, what I can expect to happen and what we're probably going to be seeing over the next couple of years is increased cooperation on missile defense, intelligence exchange and cooperation, maybe cyber cooperation, possibly counterterrorism cooperation, things that are certainly important but can be done just outside of the public eye, just below the radar of the press, start to build trust on those levels. And then one more important thing is that Israel, of course, recently joined CENTCOM, the U.S. Central Command, where we previously were in the European Command. So under the American umbrella, we're actually going to be able to do a lot more kinds of these cooperations and possibly have some kind of military exercises where the countries can use the excuse that they are cooperating with the United States and not directly with Israel within that kind of framework, within that kind of umbrella. But certainly the hope is within the next few years that we'll keep building ties and keep building the trust between our countries.
So you mentioned going around these back road type ways of making it seem like the UAE is doing more deals with the United States and not so much Israel, or how the UAE and the Gulf states, Bahrain, et cetera, need to still maintain positive relations as much as possible with Iran. Taking all of these concerns into account, do we know if there are any Gulf states, since the Abraham Accords were signed, that are taking extra security precautions with respect to Israelis flying in and out?
I can imagine that they would absolutely be increasing their security measures. But these are countries, especially the UAE, who have very strong domestic security mechanisms, very strong intelligence services. They've been dealing with their own terror threats for many years. But we can imagine, and there's probably a lot of behind the scenes intelligence sharing and other kinds of maybe best practices cooperation between Israel and the UAE as Israeli tourists, as Israeli delegations, as Israeli companies are setting up there. And we can imagine that's going to be a strong area of cooperation to ensure that the Israelis who do come to the UAE and also the Jewish community that is there are going to be safe and can travel freely and openly.
All right. Major Dan Fefferman, thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure.
In other news, if I tell you that the BBC has a problem with biased coverage on Jews in Israel, you'll tell me that the sky is blue. But a Monday evening debate on the network over whether or not Jews are an ethnic minority is now reinvigorating angered criticisms, particularly as the debating panel featured 4 non-Jewish panelists and a single Jewish commentator, Benjamin Cohen, as a guest. And Cohen, CEO of Pink News, an online LGBT newspaper, was himself not very impressed, later tweeting, "Imagine if I was black and 4 white people were asked to judge if I was a member of an ethnic minority. It would be just as offensive." The panel itself, meantime, arising in response to comments made last month by Labour MP Angela Rayner, who was congratulating a Scottish Pakistani lawmaker as being the first ever ethnic minority leader in a UK political party. Cohen responding sarcastically at the time that, quote, "I guess Jews don't count." On a personal note, Jews are an ethnic minority in every country but Israel. The namesake Jew itself referring to the descendants of Judea, or modern-day Israel and the West Bank. And even during the diaspora, Jews maintained a cultural, traditional, religious, and genealogical connection to the ancient community. And this bringing me now to our next headline. United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken enthusiastically embracing the IHRA's working definition of anti-Semitism on behalf of the United States and the Biden administration. And this putting the White House firmly against those who argue that the IHRA definition stifles free speech and legitimate criticisms of Israel. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition, including general hatred towards Jews, Holocaust denial, and denying Jews the right to self-determination, like by alleging that Israel's very existence is a racist or colonial endeavor. And in a letter to the president of the American Zionist movement in the United States, Blinken affirming that the U.S. is eager to counter Holocaust distortion and to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance, both abroad and at home. Now, speaking of taking progressive steps forward, Israel's Haifa City Council ruling Wednesday morning that LGBTQ+ couples are now eligible for full marriage benefits. Alyssa Hugel reporting.
As of Wednesday morning, all domestic partners living in the Haifa municipality can register as common law partners. And this makes them eligible for all the same benefits that any other married couple would get, regardless of gender or sexuality. That means that LGBTQ+ individuals are all covered too by this landmark ruling in Israel. Now already, Israel is hailed as being by far the most gay-friendly nation in the Middle East, with Tel Aviv even being celebrated as one of the most gay-friendly cities on earth. But there's still a ways to go. Until now, Israel's civil marriage system continues to be a politically hot topic, with only a small number of religious authorities in charge of recognizing marriages. So, same-sex couples, mixed religious couples, and Jewish couples who wish to marry outside the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate can only have their union recognized by the state, after first performing the marriages outside the country. Again, though, all this seems to be slowly but surely changing, as Haifa now makes clear. And several other municipalities across the country likewise now taking moves to extend benefits to various partnerships, regardless of gender, sexuality, or religion.
And now let's take a look at the weather forecast with Chana Rifkin.
Thanks, Aaron. Lows tonight expected to average at about 46 degrees Fahrenheit or about 8 degrees Celsius. Then highs tomorrow averaging at about 69 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees Celsius. Calling for lots of wet weather in the next 24 hours, so keep rain boots handy and don't forget that umbrella.
And now before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. Aw. It's so sad. This makes me so upset. I don't know why. Poor Emu. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.29 shekels to the American dollar and 2.61 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just don't forget to visit the all-new and improved ILTV website at iltv.tv and subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates while you're there. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.